everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's just going to take us a moment to let everyone in on Zoom. We appreciate you being patient. Great. Okay, so for those of you who are joining us now, I'm Lila LaHood. I'm the publisher of the San Francisco Public Press. You are joining us for our November 2020 local ballot review. We're going to be reviewing the local measures and candidate races. I'm here today with Laura Wenus, who is the host of Civic, our daily news and public affairs show on KSFP 102.5 FM. It's also available as a podcast. And we also have with us Joe Eskenazi, who is managing editor at Mission Local. Joe, Laura, thank you for being here with me today.
Oh, yeah, thanks for extending the invitation, and thanks for tweeting at us yesterday to remind us.
We also have Daphne Magnawa, who is our director of membership and community. She is managing operations on this call, so on this event. So you might hear Daphne pipe in here and there. If you have questions at any point, please chat them to Daphne Magnawa, and she will make sure that we receive them and address them later on in the event. Laura, Joe, should we get started?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So one other thing I should let everyone know is that we are not going in alphabetical order on the propositions. We decided to group them sort of by category theme. We're starting with housing. The first proposition in this group is Proposition A, which the city identifies as health and homelessness, parks and streets bond. This would be a $487.5 million bond. It would fund a wide range of projects. It would be repaid through property taxes. Property owners with tenants could pass through up to half of the costs of the tax, and this is common with city bonds. Mayor London Breed is the lead proponent of this bond. It's kind of been a pandemic economic recovery initiative, and it has the backing of all the supervisors. Laura, tell us, what are the different kinds of projects that this would fund, and how would the money be divided?
So this is a bond that would support everything from supportive housing and shelters to neighborhood parks to maintaining curb ramps. There's really all kinds of stuff in this. It's mostly about public infrastructure with a particular emphasis on creating jobs. So the breakdown is roughly like this. $207 million is slated for transitional supportive housing, shelters, psychiatric facilities, residential treatment facilities, respite centers, detox, sobering centers, and a behavioral access center. So this is all more in the direction of supporting people who need services for the homeless. And then there's also $239 million that are slated for parks. And that's all kinds of different parks projects, but the majority of it really goes toward neighborhood parks. And then there's 41.5 million, so another little chunk that's for basic public infrastructure, roads, plazas, curb ramps, that kind of thing. And one thing that I wanted to add is when people hear this, that landlords can pass through up to half of the cost of a bond to their tenants. I mean, you have to keep in mind how much this really is for like a $600,000 building. The owner of that is estimated to pay a little bit more than $83 a year. So half of that passing through to some tenants. Obviously, you know, like bigger apartment buildings that's gonna be proportionately more. But just it's something like less than 2 cents for every $100 a property is worth. So the total bill is unlikely to be that massive. The other thing that people usually worry about is repayment of bonds because it is borrowing money. So it will have to be paid back with interest, and over time, the city is estimated to pay back about $960 million for this bond by the time all is said and done. They're also paid through property taxes, but keep in mind that San Francisco has this policy of retiring old bonds as new bonds are passed. So it's not supposed to actually raise property taxes.
Okay, so this would raise a lot of money for a lot of different initiatives, but would not be an extreme burden on any particular property owner and tenants don't need to worry too much about how this might affect them.
I believe that's the intent.
Okay, the next one that we're going to talk about, and anyone, if you have questions about specific propositions, please mention the proposition in your note to Daphne Magnawa with your question. And Joe, it looks like you had a comment to add on Proposition A.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that this one was given the designation A. The it's almost always a bond, and a bond that's considered of great import to the city powers that be is almost always put at A. I think, Laura did a great job summing up everything that's on it. Certainly, this is extraordinary times. That said, it's never good policy to go into bonded debt to pave the streets, which I'm sure that there's a certain percentage of the city, perhaps out on the west side, that will remind people of that. Sometimes the roads that are being fixed do not last as long as the repayment plan for the bond. What I am hearing, and take this with a grain of salt, what I'm hearing is that this one's in real trouble. It needs a two-thirds majority to pass. And the anti-tax atmosphere being fostered by an extremely well-paid series of advertisements by the city's developers and powers that be put this one at risk, even if that's not their goal. The goal is to get the other tax measures that I'm sure we'll subsequently discuss. But when you light a fire, things burn. And this is a very big pinata to swat at, and it needs two-thirds. And I don't think it's getting there right now. So it's going to be an uphill drive for every last vestige of political power in the city to push this one across the finish line by November 3rd.
And talk about, being in an anti-tax atmosphere, there's a lot of different tax measures on this ballot, and voters are being asked to consider a lot of different kinds of taxes as well.
And we'll get to it all. The fun thing is that very, very few of them would the average person be paying. It depends on whose rhetoric you buy. And some of it does read like kind of warmed over Ronald Reagan logic about trickle-down economics. But that being said, the word tax is not uniformly well received, and we'll just see how generous San Francisco's voters are, in this unusual election season.
Okay. We're going to keep moving, but I know that once we get through all of these, we can definitely talk about all of these proposed taxes together. The next one we're going to talk about is Proposition K, which is identified as the Affordable Housing Authorization. This would allow the city to own and build affordable housing units rather than depend on nonprofits or private developers for that. It's not that they would stop being created by those methods, but that the city could also do it. And there is a specific reason why this needs to go to the voters. And Laura, I would like you to explain that reason.
Yeah, so this is really an authorization, and the pilot program that this is supposed to initiate, I think, is probably not the main reason why it needs to go to the voters. The reason it needs to go to the voters is because of an article in the California Constitution that's from way back in 1950. And the issue that raised was it created this barrier to creating low rent housing in communities and required a vote on this. And it has been widely described as a racist measure. It was put on the ballot to keep low-income housing out and to keep communities segregated. The Spurs voter guide notes that this is an article that has delayed low-income housing development, California-wide, and it's weakened efforts to integrate some really exclusive suburban communities. But because it's an article in the Constitution, local communities have to vote on allowing something like social housing. And I'll just, real quick, I know we don't have so much time because we have 13 ballot measures to get through, but the idea behind this, what this actually authorizes, is something called social housing, which is essentially a municipal version of public housing.
Okay, and why, and either one of you, why does San Francisco want to own and build housing rather than have nonprofits and other developers do that?
It's a different model. So you can create really deep affordability if the city is owning and operating it. I think it's a new thing for San Francisco. And this is primarily the authorization and would allow a pilot program for San Francisco to try it. But in a lot of cases, like our public housing right now is operated by nonprofits. It's transitioned from HUD to nonprofit management. And so this would be a different way to manage affordable housing. And it's something that has a precedent primarily in Europe. Like Vienna is the example that the authors of this proposition look to as a way to create more affordable housing that is also more affordable, if that makes sense, at deeper levels of affordability.
And not to be the Statler and Waldorf here, critiquing everything, but the city does own some housing. They own Midtown right there on Geary. And that's not a model that anyone would say was working great. The people there have been fighting for years to get full recognition of their rights as tenants. And as far as Laura aptly mentioned, that nonprofits run our public housing, that was it's very hard to convince San Francisco people to privatize anything, but that was wholeheartedly embraced because of the terrible, terrible years-long debacle of public housing in San Francisco when it was public. So looking towards Europe or anywhere else would probably be advisable. But with that said, this is just an authorization. This is just giving us the permission to even think about those things. It doesn't allocate any money. It doesn't put anything into any motion. It doesn't hire anybody. It doesn't buy any wood or nails. It's just an authorization.
Okay, that was the great comments from both of you. We're going to switch to our next topic area, which is government oversight. The first one we're going to talk about is Proposition B, which the city identifies as Department of Sanitation and Streets, Sanitation and Streets Commission, and Public Works Commission. This charter amendment would split the Public Works Department into two. We would have the Department of Public Works and the Department of Sanitation and Streets. Both departments would be overseen by commissions. The goal would be to improve sanitation citywide, but there are also some oversight components to this and intention of helping eliminate corruption and waste. This restructuring effort comes in part in response to this saga that Joe has been covering extensively about this FBI probe uncovering alleged corruption in San Francisco government. So Joe, tell us a little bit about your reporting and how it relates to this proposition. And so we can talk about the mechanics, but then why are we voting on this thing?
Well, in January, the FBI arrested Public Works Director Mohammed Nuru, who has been higher up in the department for 20 years and has been running the department for a little less than 10 years since he was appointed to the post by former Mayor Ed Lee. And while the charges that the U.S. attorney has fired at Nuru are pretty small-timey with regard to low-level bribery, it just points to a culture of just endemic corruption in the department. And all of the materials that have come out since have pointed to, high-level bid rigging and corruption of the highest order. And these are backed up by wiretaps and text messages, and it's all spelled out pretty clearly. In the meantime, the city spends tens of millions of dollars on cleaning its streets, and its streets are objectively filthy. That's something that is hard to miss. The condition of San Francisco streets is like catnip for out-of-town media. And is used to actually sully the idea of liberal government. So I could think that almost anything that would at least ostensibly take aim at that has a fighting chance of passing. What this would do technically, as you mentioned, is break the department up. And the department's pretty nebulous. It does a lot of things. Not only does it clean the streets, there's lots of construction involved, hundreds of millions of dollars going to various contractors. And as you've seen, Mohammed Nuru was given broad leeway to do as he pleased. And what's more, in a very little known move, his former boss, Ed Lee, took the oversight of the mayor's office away from Mohammed Nuru about 5 or 6 years ago. So he was his own check and balance, which, to borrow a line from Benjamin Wax, my friend and co-writer, that's not just the fox guarding the henhouse, that's the fox opening up a KFC franchise. So I can see why people have an appetite for this. The commissions that as we've proven, we have a commission over almost every other major department, and this is a huge department with lots of money. It's not a fail-safe against corruption. There's corruption coming out in many of the other departments in San Francisco, but to not have even the perfunctory step of a commission overseeing public works is kind of jarring in San Francisco. So if you believe that government can solve government's problems, then you might be inclined to vote for this. What it would do is break the department in half, and each of them would have a commission. There would be some duplicative administrative stuff, et cetera. The controller believes it would cost $6 million extra. Perhaps it would. Something to keep in mind is a baseline as we go through all of this conversation here. The city, as of 2017, spent $1.19 million a year on toilet paper. So just keep that in mind when we talk about how much things cost in San Francisco to do. So this, it's supported by the unions. It's supported by 7 of the supervisors. But, it'll be interesting to see, again, in an anti-tax atmosphere where there's $12.5 million now in the war chest of the Neighbors for a Better San Francisco targeting tax measures and targeting progressive supervisors, if something that by definition creates more government, more commissions, and will cost more money is going to get 50 plus 1% of the vote.
Okay, Laura, anything to add to that, or should we go to the next one?
No, let's go to the next one because let's talk about commissions some more.
Exactly. So, more on commissions. Proposition D is about sheriff oversight. The sheriff's department does not currently have a local oversight body. Sheriff's departments are actually established by state law. This charter amendment would create a city body, the Sheriff's Department Oversight Board, which would include an inspector general. Neither the oversight board nor the inspector general would have any disciplinary power, and they couldn't set policy for the department, but they could hold hearings and issue subpoenas and do other things. So Laura, it sounds like this wouldn't directly affect how activity at the sheriff's department, but it would add a formal layer of community oversight. What do proponents think this will do, and is anyone opposed to this?
Well, I mean, sheriffs are law enforcement, right? So they play a lot of law enforcement roles in the same way that the police department play law enforcement roles. And they, for example, our jails are under the sheriff's purview. Mm-hmm. So this is really an attempt to establish an oversight body, kind of parallel to the police commission for the sheriff's department. It would be the sheriff's commission, basically. And the idea is, yeah, they can't tell them how to do their jobs necessarily, but they could ask them to come testify before the commission. They could go visit facilities, which means they could go visit jails, and they can refer cases for criminal prosecution. So the district attorney already can bring criminal charges against sheriff's deputies, but this adds another mechanism for that. And I think opponents are saying, oh, we already have a mechanism for this. One of them, like I said, is the district attorney, which already has that power. However, there's also mention in the opposition argument about the sheriff's department's internal affairs investigation unit, but that is a unit within the sheriff's department. This would be an external unit that would be fundamentally different.
Well, someone who's opposed to this is the sheriff. Sheriff Miyamoto is opposed to this, and it's not because Sheriff Miyamoto wants to have the Wild West atmosphere that's embarrassed the hell out of this department for the last few years continue. And the sheriff's department has really some of the highlights of lowlights of law enforcement misbehavior in the last few years have come out of the sheriff's department, most notably with allegations of prisoner fight club and things of that nature. Something that is interesting is because this is a measure that was pushed and authored by Supervisor Shaman Walton. Whether in response to him or not, and it certainly looks like it was in response to this measure going on the ballot, the Sheriff's Department and the Department of Police Accountability have struck a deal that the Department of Police Accountability, no matter what happens with this measure, will have enhanced investigatory powers over the Sheriff's Department as it does over the Police Department. And it can take the cases rather than having them referred internally, which is a huge problem. Actual inmates and others who've been aggrieved by the sheriffs can go to the Department of Police Accountability. That's how it is now. If this were to pass, and I would have to guess that most people in San Francisco in 2020 would probably vote for more scrutiny of law enforcement rather than less, and probably won't dwell on the potentially duplicative nature of it. If this were to pass, that will take precedence. But even if it doesn't pass, the Sheriff's Department is going to get more scrutiny regardless.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. Proposition E, police staffing. So back in 1994, San Francisco voters passed a charter amendment requiring the police department to always keep 1,971 full-duty officers on the force. This amendment would eliminate that mandatory minimum, and it would add a little bit more oversight on staffing. So let's talk about this in context. This year in the spring and summer, we saw, large and extended protests nationwide against police brutality, inspired by the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, and calls from Black Lives Matter and other groups to defund the police. How is this proposition connected to those actions, and who opposes this measure?
I can take that.
I think Joe knows a little bit more about the history.
So the answer to the question is it's not, but then again it is, because when President of the board, Supervisor Norman Yee, introduced this, it was about expediency. And it said, rather than locking into this totally arbitrary number that the city often fails to make, the 1,971, why not go through a thorough analysis of the policing needs and do that instead? And in fact, the city has gone through a very thorough analysis of its needs, and it actually called for hiring some 300 more police. But in eliminating the charter minimum, it would give you flexibility either way. And as a result, the Police Officers Association, the Police Officers Union, was against this from the start, as any union would be, because it took away a guaranteed minimum number of employees. This was introduced only days before George Floyd died, and then it suddenly took on a much more resonant tone.
Yeah.
You cannot defund the SFPD without passing Proposition E. You cannot. You will not be able to affect hiring practices without passing Proposition E. And defund has got to be the worst branding since sour cream. But if it means deferring this money into social services, et cetera, giving police more police-like jobs and getting them out of the social work business, you can't do that without passing Proposition E. So funny story, and I'll go quick because we do have a lot to do here. The Police Officers Association was sitting down with President Yee's office, and they were doing meet and confer, and they were slowing it down to the point where he very nearly missed the cutoff to get this onto the ballot. And it was not until outside attorneys got wind of what was happening that they inveighed upon President Yee that he was getting potentially over-conservative advice from the city attorney's office and deferring too much to the police union in their ability to slow this down and negotiate beforehand. Because you do have to meet and confer when you change the conditions of a job, but this doesn't do that. This just opens up the possibility of that.
Yeah.
So he pushed ahead, and it was put onto the ballot unanimously. And I would say it stands an excellent chance of passing. Who doesn't want this? Are law and order types in the police union. And any union, a liberal union, a conservative union, would probably balk at something that takes away a guaranteed minimum employment level.
Laura, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I would add, I mean, for one thing, like Joe mentioned, the city has not always succeeded in meeting that minimum. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think that there's also something to be said here for the definition of full duty officers. This isn't just striking the number in the bare minimum. It's also striking a couple key passages about how and for what people can be hired into the department. So, for example, Indivisible SF, one of the supporters of this measure ostensibly, which has done an analysis of it and supports defunding the police, depending on if you subscribe to that branding or not. One of their arguments in favor of it is if you want to civilianize the police force and make more jobs, you know, like desk jobs, make those go to civilian staff rather than police officers, then this is a way to start down that road. I mean, that also ostensibly can save money because an individual, you know, full duty sworn officer costs $155,000 a year. So there's a couple different elements to this that go beyond just slashing that number out of the law.
And while we have often not made the 1,971, no legal action will take place as long as we're close and as long as there's an ostensible effort to do it. But if the city were to take moves to really get below that number, we'd be sued and we'd lose.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next category, taxes and business policy. So Proposition F is the business tax overhaul. This would be a combined charter amendment and ordinance that would shift the tax burden away from small businesses and more toward larger ones. And the biggest relief would go to restaurants, retail, arts, and other businesses that have suffered during the pandemic. It is also designed to create a mechanism for the city to spend funds from previously voter-approved taxes that are tied up in litigation. So I've got a question for each of you, and I'm going to start with Laura. This one seems really complicated, and you talked to Amanda Freed from the Office of the Treasurer and Tax Collector for a show on Civic. What do we need to know about the different parts of this measure, the tax reform, the pandemic relief, and the litigation response?
How to say this in the shortest way possible. It looks complicated, but it's something that is a continuation of something set in motion earlier. So part of the reason why there's this massive business tax overhaul is because we're moving away as a city from payroll taxes to gross receipts taxes. So that's taxes based on how much you pay your workers versus how much you make in revenue. And that's something that voters decided back in, I think, 2012. So this is just the finalization of that and the figuring out the way to do that. And it does result in a tax increase on really like higher revenue businesses. Primarily, I would say that this is something that increases taxes on the tech industry in San Francisco. And the way that it's going to be rolled out, I think, is stepped so that businesses are not going to feel the brunt of it while we're in the middle of a pandemic and an economic downturn as a result of the pandemic. And the other part of it is a backstop that sort of tries to backfill money that is held up in litigation. And the way it does it is basically with a replacement tax that would be subject to slightly different rules. And we can go into detail about that if people want to, but I don't know that it's essential to know it.
That might be some of the most intriguing stuff, though, because they lost all the wind out of their sails when something that's ostensibly good happened, which is that the city won on homeless measure Prop C.
That's right.
They lost that advertising pitch of let's get that Prop C money and start housing the homeless. So suddenly you can't
although there
do that
is
anymore.
still some revenue wrapped up in litigation, and this would backfill that if the city loses in court. But given that the city has not lost in court on previous similar cases, I think there's an expectation that the city will be successful again.
Yeah. It would be, while that money is not in the city's hands yet, it's for other measures that were argued along remarkably similar lines, to get, I don't want to bog down everybody. And the overall statement on Prop F is don't worry about it. Like it has to be complicated because taxation is complicated.
Because it's tax.
But getting too caught up in the mechanism of it, you don't need to know how the car works in order to drive the car sometimes, right? And in this particular case, the very same people who, the tech people who benefited so greatly from the 2012 change that they pushed hard are now we're arguing against what they asked for, and now might be asked to pay a little bit more. And other businesses that had, like no one cries for the hedge funds, no one cries for the real estate interests who took it in the chin as a result of what we voted in 2012. This is going to be attacked by anti-tax forces who don't want to pay taxes. And it remains to be seen, whether the average voter is going to be swayed by the city's most powerful people saying that if they have to pay taxes, they will take it out on you, which is basically how that comes out.
I have a specific question for you because I know you wrote about the fact that Mayor Breed supported this measure but hasn't been actively campaigning for it. But the city budget was created based on the expectation that this would pass. Can you tell us a little more about this?
It was, and we did get a huge shot in the arm when the Prop C money was freed up when the Supreme Court did not take that case. However, there's still about $150 million or thereabouts that, if this doesn't pass, it does blow a pretty sizable hole in the budget. People in the city are complaining. People in the city are complaining that the mayor is not putting her heft and her fundraising heft behind this, and it is her allies that are leading this anti-tax crusade and amassing truly gaudy amounts of money. I do not think they would be so bold as to do that if they got a call from the occupant of room 200 saying, cut it out. I don't think they've gotten that call. No one has gotten a horse's head in his bed yet. Far from it.
Oh my goodness.
This is the mayor's initiative here, and even more so was Prop A, which if it does not pass would be not only devastating, but devastating politically for the mayor. So we'll see what happens with that. People who've been pushing for this say that they could use a little bit more help from the mayor, and they do wish that the mayor's allies didn't feel so free and easy campaigning against any and all taxes that are on the ballot.
Okay, I am going to move to the next one. We've got Proposition H, Neighborhood Commercial Districts and City Permitting. So this is an ordinance. It's meant to help small businesses that are help them weather the pandemic by making it easier to get permits for certain uses of public space and streamlining permitting in general. We've heard about small business owners struggling with the complicated permitting process for years, and Mayor Breed put this measure on the ballot. Opponents say it makes things complicated and that there wasn't enough public input. This is also one of many pandemic response propositions. Laura, how would this one help the local economy?
So this is for things like opening up a parklet or using, public space outside of their storefront, about permitting certain uses like, arts organizations to come in and open a space. Or I think there's also like co-working space, like allowance for co-working spaces. In places where there might have been more hurdles to get permits for that kind of thing. That's the pandemic response part in general. And then we're talking about like commercial corridors, right? This is not just like anywhere in the city. But in general, it would try to lower the barriers and speed up the time that it takes to get permits to either open a new business or to get permits for an existing business to do more things.
Okay, Joe,
The
any
argument
ads
against
on
it,
that one?
the argument against it, which does make sense, is that all of these goals could be accomplished without us voting on them.
Yes.
That all of the organizations that are so slow issuing permits, do work for the mayor, and she and the board could just do this. So that when you vote on things like this, you're voting on a whole lot of it. And here in California, I don't need to give you so many examples of crazy measures that we've voted into effect that have unforeseen consequences. With that said, if this was going to get done, it could have gotten done anytime in the last 20 years. So at some point, I understand why people are losing their patience and want to get it done, with one fell swoop.
Yeah, this is
I
not
don't
one of
I
those
don't
things
foresee
where it's
anybody
like,
getting in the way of this one.
yeah, this is not one of those measures where it's like it has to go before the voters because it's a tax increase. It's like, well, this is, a change at to the zoning and planning code. And so one of the arguments against it is, well, this isn't our job to decide on as voters.
Got it. Okay. So I'm going to move to the next one. Proposition I, which is the real estate transfer tax. This measure would double the transfer tax on properties worth $10 million or more. And there are actually two tiers. There's one for 10 million to 25 million, and then one's over 25 million. Currently, the lower level, there's a 2.75% transfer tax and 3% on the above 25 million. And this would double that. There are also a couple of other rules related to that. But this part is really interesting. The Board of Supervisors has resolved to earmark these transfer tax revenues for a fund that would pay landlords who forgive back rents owed by coronavirus affected tenants. I thought that was really interesting. And Laura, you talked with Supervisor Dean Preston, who wrote the measure, and Jay Cheng, who opposes it, who's with the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. What did you learn from your conversations with them?
So a couple things. So Proposition I would fund, yes, the rent repayment program. It would reimburse landlords who agree to forgive back rent for tenants affected by the coronavirus pandemic, I believe 50% of the back rent owed. And then in the longer term, the funds are supposed to go to the pilot project or pilot program rather, of the social housing authorized by Proposition K, which we talked about earlier. So that's where things would go after the pandemic. What I'm told in terms of the reason people oppose this is, well, what are the kinds of buildings that are worth $10 million and $25 million? They're not necessarily mansions in San Francisco. They're big office buildings and they're big housing buildings. And so the concern is that if you add, a tax when a building is sold, the developer of a building is going to have to sell it in order for, the person who will own it or company who will own it in perpetuity to move people in there. And so if you add another tax at that sale, the concern is that this might discourage developers from continuing to build. Certainly there's a question about the viability of building office space right now in San Francisco when I think like 14% of it is vacant.
Right.
So those are sort of the pros and cons there.
Joe, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a worthwhile point, but to believe the opponents, it would harm small businesses. But in order to buy that argument, you have to believe that these owners are going to pass all of their losses onto the businesses. It's, how can I say, it's like, it would be like arguing against lowering the price of liquor because people will drink it and then they will get into fights, and it assumes the worst intentions of those who are affected by the initial act. The more realistic argument against it I can see is right here in the controller statement, just about the volatility of this tax, ranging from $13 million in one year to $346 million in another, with an average of $196 million. And also the fact that it would cause all kinds of tax avoidance behavior of people selling things for $24,999,999 and that kind of thing, and just creative new ways of cheating. But with that said, it's very hard to get away from the fact that this is a tax on high-level real estate. It's a matter of 2.75% versus 5.5%, et cetera. That's a lot of money, but it's very hard to imagine. It's very hard to imagine anyone who's giving it lots of thought and isn't a real estate professional, really having their heart bleed for the poor impoverished developers. It's just a matter. We'll see. The money raised against this has been staggering, and we'll see, because the money against this, shows small businesses and tugs at your heartstrings. People who read through the measure may be surprised at the discordance with those images.
So I'll just note on that, the one thing I learned from my conversation with Jay Cheng, and I'll note that also this is reflected on the actual ballot, even if it isn't terribly prominent in the voter guides or summaries. So this does also not just apply to sales, but also to 35-year leases, which is one thing that I think is not immediately evident when people look at the word transfer tax. And then I think another, you know what, I'm not even going to go there.
Well, but if anybody's really curious, they can ask a question at the end.
One other thing that might be worth noting, and I think my camera is just kicked off here. It's struggling. Is in order to avoid having to vote this at a 2/3 threshold, as Laura intimated, it's not binding. The money is supposed to go to the worthy causes that she mentioned, but it doesn't have to.
Yeah,
if San Francisco were to catch on fire, we could divert those funds to other things. So so it's not binding.
Okay, I'm going to keep us going because we have a couple more to get through. Proposition J, another tax. This is a parcel tax for the San Francisco Unified School District. The interesting thing is this is a repeal and replace. This measure would repeal a 2018 parcel tax to fund schools and replace it with a lower tax. There are a couple of exemptions here. The difference is that the 2018 tax passed with a majority, but not a supermajority. And there's currently a lawsuit that is keeping the money tied up in court. So Laura, how much money is tied up in court, and why would the city want to forego revenues from a higher tax if it expects that it would have access to those funds eventually, or is the city worried that the case is going to be decided the other way?
Well, so the point here is to get a higher margin of approval because it's a special tax. It needs the 2/3 majority. It needs the supermajority to pass. And the hope is that if you lower the amount, then you can get more people to agree to it. I mean, it also has a carve out, for example, for the primary homes of seniors would not be affected by this parcel tax. So that's really where this is going. And the idea is to just like get the funding in order to primarily pay for raises for teachers and paraeducators that were approved way back in 2018. So this is more of, it's like you said, a repeal and replace. I think that's phrasing.
I think this one's in deep trouble. And I think that there's going to be a lot of recriminations if and when it fails, as for broken promises about fundraising and public support.
Okay, I'm going to jump to the next one. People might have questions on Proposition J, so please put those in the chat to Daphne Magnawa. We will come back to them at the end. Proposition L, another tax. This is a business tax based on the comparison of the top executives' pay at a company to employees' pay. This business tax is intended to encourage businesses to equalize their pay structure or pay a higher tax rate. Laura, I know in some of your reporting you found that this would hit the retail sector harder with the current configuration of executives and employees in the city. And opponents say businesses just might move their lowest paid workers out of the city or stop hiring entry-level employees. So talk about this.
Clear, that was not my reporting. That was from Recode, but it's just looking at the different
you found it.
companies that operate in San Francisco, and one of them is Gap, and their CEO pay to median worker pay is something like 3,000 to 1. It's more than 3,000 to 1 actually. And this targets businesses whose pay ratios are more than 100 to 1. So there's a couple arguments here. I mean, part of the argument is this is something that hasn't really been done a lot before. Portland has a similar tax. Part of the argument in favor of it is not so much it'll bring in all this money, but more like it'll either bring in money or it will change company behavior, business behavior. And then there's arguments against that saying, well, it might not change businesses' behavior at all, or it might change businesses' behavior in a way that we don't want. Like, as you mentioned, moving the employees that are lowest paid out of San Francisco, since the median worker pay there is calculated based on the San Francisco workers, not global workers, like that 3,000 to 1 ratio might have been based on. So that's a concern. The other question is, will they bring, will this actually do what it's advertised to do? I mean, there's a question as to whether you can make a business change its behavior just by hitting it with this level of a tax?
It's very hard to predict what might happen. I think Laura got to all of the different angles. I don't perceive, an epiphany for these businesses. The worst case scenario would be low-income workers being harmed. With that said, again, it's very hard to. The curb appeal of this is very nice. So we'll see. We have similar measures like this about other things that businesses have to go through and account for their past slaveholding behavior and things like that. And that did not seem to drive business out of San Francisco. If San Francisco is looking to see what will drive business out of the city, we may find that out in the next few years. It probably won't be Prop L.
Okay, we got through all of the San Francisco propositions. Now we're going to talk about Regional Measure RR, which is the Caltrain sales tax. This is San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara counties will be voting on this. It would be a 1/8 cent sales tax meant to provide critical funding for Caltrain. It is needed, but this is actually not an emergency measure brought on by the coronavirus pandemic. And one thing, Michael Stoll and I were chuckling about this yesterday. Who decided to call it Measure RR, like RR for railroad?
That's possible. I will note on that measure that there was in 2016 another Measure RR that was for BART.
I think there's something there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking it up and you see something about BART, and now we're talking about Caltrain, yes, I mean these are railroad taxes. Keep in mind on this one that it does need 3 counties' approval. And it would be, as I understand it, the first time that Caltrain would actually have dedicated funding that the state can't, meddle with. So it would be an income stream for Caltrain to provide improved service. It didn't end up on the ballot, like you said, because of the coronavirus pandemic. Although, yes, Caltrain is facing severely diminished ridership because of the coronavirus pandemic.
Lots of fingers to point at this one, because it's just bad governance that we've had to vote for this Hail Mary across 3 different counties. And there are also boards that have to be convinced, boards that are hostile. Santa Clara County is not a fan. San Francisco County, this got to be very dramatic. And accusations of propagandizing and whatnot. And I think that Supervisors Peskin and Walton may have walked into a bushwhack coming out against the initial measure, because they were painted as trying to kill Caltrain. But separate and apart from your feelings on that, like for all 3 counties to have to vote on this and all of them to have to pass by 2/3, someone's really maneuvered us into a very bad place. So I think that the questions about Caltrain's governance and independence are very real. With that said, these are tough times. And with that also said, my understanding is that this will be 1 cent for every $8. So while sales taxes are regressive, that's not a lot of money.
Yep.
Okay, we're moving on to election reform. We have 2 propositions here. We've got Proposition C, which is removing citizenship requirements for members of city bodies. This would be a charter amendment that would say that San Francisco residents of voting age could be appointed to city policy bodies, and oversight boards, even if they aren't citizens. It seems like there's a lot of support for this and minimal opposition. Tell us how we got here and who's supporting this initiative.
So the Board of Supervisors placed this on the ballot by unanimous vote. And I think the genesis of this is that, San Francisco has a lot of people who contribute a lot to its economy, but also its politics and its policy, who are not citizen. And so this is an opportunity to allow them to engage with local government in a much more direct way. And in particular, to allow people who, I don't think that it was aimed specifically at people who are undocumented, but it does include them. And so this is a way for them to, again, participate in local government in a way that they're currently barred from doing.
Arguments requiring people to be citizens to do things oftentimes run into nonsensical contradictions because they're really not about that. Like, for example, making every TSA person a citizen didn't make a whole lot of sense because the guy next to her with a machine gun in the army fatigues does not have to be a citizen. And in the same way, I don't understand why your being a citizen is necessary in order to serve on the MTA board or serve on the planning commission or serve on the police commission and be yelled at and insulted for 8 hours on a Zoom call by members of the general public. In San Francisco, I think it has not been rolled out very efficiently, and we could certainly fix the kinks, but it made sense for school board elections to be open to all parents and all people in the city, because a goodly percentage of children in the school district are children of immigrants and non-citizens. This is, I think, even less against the norms. This isn't giving rights of citizenship to people who aren't citizens. It's allowing you to serve on a commission.
Right. As I understand it, you have to be appointed. You're not even running for office.
Right.
Yes. I mean, certainly you can't. It's only appointed positions. It's not. We do have elections for some commissions, but such as City College, but that's rare. And San Francisco has so many commissions that sometimes it doesn't know how many commissions it has. So I
and we might be adding more.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. Like on DPW there. If we were to approve Proposition B, then we would have 2 more commissions. Yep. And I don't think it would be terrible to have the point of view of an immigrant on some of these commissions. All I care about is competence, right? So that doesn't make sense to me. You're not breaking down the Constitution here. The arguments against it, and we've voted on things like this in the past, and they've been slam dunked. But 20 years ago, domestic partner benefits was a controversial measure. Now it isn't. I would have to think that this is such a minimal step. And I don't see it as a camel's nose or a slippery slope. It's just allowing people to serve on commissions that are, more or less volunteer work. And if you are not a citizen, it really isn't upwardly mobile either, because you're going, you have to be a citizen to attain elected office. So it just strikes me as for people who want to serve.
So I'm going to jump on. We have the last proposition here, Proposition G, also related to youth voting in local elections. So this is a charter amendment that would lower the voting age in San Francisco to 16. This means that residents who are 16 and 17 years old could vote in local elections for local candidates and measures. They still couldn't vote for state and federal offices, but it would extend voting rights to 16 and 17-year-olds locally. The interesting thing is that a similar measure was unsuccessful in 2016. So why didn't this pass the first time it was on the ballot, and what's different this time around?
So I can't speak to why voters didn't fully support this enough for it to actually pass the first time around, but I will say that it was very narrow. I think it was like a single-digit percent, like 4% or something, that it fell shy of what it needed to pass. And in the meantime, youth organizations have been organizing a lot around this, and some of their messaging is, we pay taxes, we work, we support our families, we are active in our communities, and when younger people vote, first of all, when they start voting younger, they're more likely to continue voting for the rest of their lives. They're more likely to make that a habit. And they're also more likely to encourage their families to participate in elections. So really all around, this is a measure that would improve and increase political participation from people from all walks of life all over the city.
Okay.
The only argument against it is that where do you draw the line? And 18, which we use as adult for many things. 16, you can drive a car, or at least it used to be. Buying alcohol is 21, etc. I can see why people thought 16 was too young. I think there are plenty of 16-year-olds who can go through a ballot guide and understand it fine, and there are plenty of 48-year-olds who cannot. So I think that people just probably just thought 16 was too young, and they thought it was a goofy thing and a politically motivated move on behalf of the city's lefties. And maybe it is, but on the other hand, I think we would insult the 16-year-olds of San Francisco at our own peril. And it's their city and their world coming up, and get them started early.
Okay, to be clear, this is a nonpartisan ballot review, and any we are not endorsing any of these measures or any positions. And if there are any questions related to anything that we've discussed with any of the measures or the city measures or regional measure RR, we would love to have your questions. We're going to dip into the candidate races. Because of the way they're structured, we have the odd number supervisor seats up for election this season. So that means at least half of the city is not voting for a supervisor, and you're only voting for the one in your district. But depending on the outcome of the supervisor races, how could this shift the balance of power on the board? What are we looking at this season?
It's complicated, it's always been a misnomer, and more so of late, to say that there's progressives and moderates. There's progressives and then there's progressives. There does seem to be the dividing line between more centrist progressives and more lefty progressives. And some of that really does seem to be who your consultant is. So we'll see, and what happens there. Will we have a board that is amenable to Mayor Breed or not, leading up to her, her next election campaign? Some people on that board, may have mayoral aspirations of their own. We've got a bigger problem. We've got to run the city. It's going to probably be a more balanced board than it is now. But by and large, with a few flare-ups, there. How can I say? I have not seen quite the level of acrimony on this board that I have seen in some years past. And, we can critique the government as much as we want, but it doesn't seem to be quite as caught up in vindictiveness and tit for tat as we've seen in the past. Every race that's contested is hard to pick. District 1 could go either way. District 5 could go either way. District 7 could go multiple ways. District 11 could go multiple ways. It's very, very hard to predict, and it could change the board from being, highly progressive to being, more or less split down the middle. It's hard right now because of just how unpredictable things are, and because, everything coming down from Washington to figure out like what this will do for the city. But, there's a lot at play. And I think that a couple hundred votes may well decide, the direction of the city legislatively for the next few years. And due to COVID, the strategies are very different now. And so it's very hard to know, what would have happened in a more normal world.
So one thing that we noticed on this ballot, there are a lot of recognizable players who are players in city politics, some incumbents and some not, some names that are sort of returning from past elections. What should voters know about some of these familiar names that are appearing again on the ballot this season?
Out in District 11, where I am, John Avalos is running for his old seat against the incumbent, Asha Safai, his successor. Avalos beat Asha Safai to become a supervisor a decade and change ago. This is going to be a close race. Both of these men are very tight with labor. Both of them have high name recognition. There is a good deal of personal animosity at stake. It's going to be a tight race. If you're thinking elsewhere, Marjan Filhauer in District 1 was defeated by Sandra Lee Feuer last time around and is running again, and is a formidable opponent because she has the name recognition, and she's a very, very, very effective fundraiser, and has the support of the mayor and a lot of the city's political establishment, and is tireless. And Connie Chan, her opponent, another figure you probably would have to know city government pretty well to know, but has been around. An Asian American, Chinese American, that's always an advantage in District 1. Aaron Peskin running for his 27th term in District 3. Dean Preston and Valley Brown are facing off again in District 5. Dean Preston defeated her by something like 141 votes just a year ago, filling out London Breed's old term. That's going to go to the voters again. And then once again, we have Joel Engardio. This is his third race in District 7, third time. And, he is a front runner this time. Because, frankly, the progressive side could not settle upon a candidate. And, I don't see a 1-2 strategy there. So Myrna Melgar and Velasco Nguyen, could cannibalize votes from one another. So it's going to be very interesting. Hillary Ronan, the incumbent, running without opposition. Who else did you have in mind?
I think you've hit most of the key ones. Maybe we'll just sort of say the Board of Education has offered them a springboard for local politics. Do you have anything to say about the candidates in this race, or maybe who is now in higher office who has used that springboard to positive effect?
Oh, there's so many. Jane Kim, Matt Haney, Eric Marr, Sandra Lee Fewer, Shaman Walton. The Board of Education is a big deal in San Francisco. It's a citywide election, and if you win a citywide election, that says an awful lot. And so there are people on the Board of Education that could ostensibly, want to go on to greater roles in San Francisco government. On the other hand, that may not be their desire. It remains to be seen. And, we do have to fill quite a few vacancies this time around. Rachel Norton is not running again. I think there are a couple of vacancies. To your point, Lila, I could be mistaken. It looks like the people who are running this time appear at least to be more school focused, but you never know. You never know.
So before we go to taking questions, Laura, anything else to add or anything to say in particular about City College Board or BART board races? Actually, maybe if you could tell people what they can find from candidates on our website about those statements that you gathered.
Yeah, thanks. That's where I was going to go. So we did actually reach out to all of the candidates in local races and ask them to submit an audio statement, which will be stitched together for a broadcast of Civic coming up soon. But you can find their individual statements under the individual races, all the districts, school board and City College Board, and also the two district seats for BART board. I don't think that every candidate responded, but we did reach out to them all, and you can find the responses from the folks who were able to get back to us with an audio recording there. So you can hear them make their case in their own words.
Okay. And we should also say, for those who have not seen it yet, we have a comprehensive local voter guide on sfpublicpress.org. If you go to our homepage, there's a big banner at the top that will take you there. I think Daphne has dropped it in the chat on Zoom, and we can add it soon for those who have been watching on YouTube or who might be watching it later. Daphne, questions. I know we had a couple early on that I could throw to our panelists, but actually, we should clarify again for those who may have joined late what Civic is. Civic is our daily news and public affairs show. Laura is the host. It airs on KSFP 102.5 FM in San Francisco. It is also available as a podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And Laura, thank you for answering all these questions today. Joe Eskenazi is the managing editor at Mission Local. You can read more of his work at missionlocal.org. I'm going to run to the couple of questions that we had, and then we'll see if any others come in about specific measures. From Eleanor, are there any obligations for Prop A to distribute funds to certain neighborhoods or quadrants in the city?
Well, there are certain projects that there are earmarks for them. So there's $25 million that's supposed to go to renovating Japantown Peace Plaza. $30 million is supposed to go to Gene Friend Recreation Center in Soma. $29 million are supposed to create a waterfront park at India Basin. The India Basin Park project is this massive project. We actually did a whole interview about this on Civic with a reporter who wrote a story about the India Basin project for the public press. But that is one of the earmarks. And then there's also $54 million that are going to Portsmouth Square in Chinatown. So there's set asides for specific sub projects of these sort of like umbrella project terms. I don't believe that there are specific earmarks for mental health or substance abuse services to go to specific neighborhoods. It's to build out the infrastructure for those.
Okay. And Joe, here's a question specifically for you. Curious about Joe's references to recriminations over Proposition J. Please say more.
It's not polling well right now. It needs the 2/3. And, I believe, and I can't say this with utmost certainty, but my understanding is that not all of the elected officials who said that they would raise money and campaign for it have done so with gusto. And, if it is to fail, and many people predict it, passing at 2/3 right now, then there's going to be a lot of very angry teachers and angry teachers unions. So that's, if I can be a little bit opaque, that's what I was referring to.
Okay, and we have sort of a series of related questions from Alice. She says, there's a lot of dark money being used to produce hit pieces in the supervisors' races, particularly in District 5. And she said there have been attacks on Dean Preston, the incumbent, and on Valley Brown. How can we counter these daily hit pieces by dark money, which completely belie the facts? What can be done? And she goes into more detail, but I don't know if you want me to go into more detail or if you'd like to respond to that.
I'm glad that she brought that up, because when I added up the numbers initially on the ethics page, it was $3.1 million in a matter of a few weeks for the San Francisco, Neighbors for a Better San Francisco. But then when I went to the advanced page there and added it all up, I realized I hadn't added up all the numbers. They've amassed $12.5 million. And that's a lot of cheddar to spread around in district elections in San Francisco, where a couple hundred votes either way are going to decide it, and also to potentially founder a few tax measures. It's a tremendous amount of money. And many of the donors are, Republican mega givers. Many of them are just, city luminaries of the sort that you would expect from the old school city establishment. I don't know who's making the ads. The ads are of elite Atwater level. They are very lurid. Many of them are challenged factually. It's going to be a test of San Franciscans to see what people respond to. For example, in District 5, which you brought up, San Franciscans in District 5 voted by 2-1 to oppose Proposition Q back, I believe, in 2016, which would have basically given the green light to boot homeless people out of their tents and put them in non-existent housing, which there specifically wasn't money for. It was seen as a fairly heavy-handed measure, and District 5 voters responded in kind. Well, the nonstop imagery of crazed homeless people and needles and feces and tents resonate differently now in 2020. It remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. So we'll see if that is something that spurs San Franciscans to vote for the more moderate candidates that are being supported by these IEs, which, by the way, these candidates don't officially have a hand in this measure. And also the tax measures. We'll see if San Franciscans, will believe taxes. This campaign by the wealthiest of us will be negative for them and their well-being. So it's a real test for San Francisco.
So, we got another question. I think someone who may have joined us a little bit later asking if we addressed the state Senate race. We did not specifically talk about that. If you go to our public press voter guide, we do have, Laura had actually previously interviewed Senator Scott Wiener and Jackie Fielder for 2 Civic episodes, which we are linked in the page that we created for the election guide. And they also provided us with additional statements. I don't know, Laura, if you want to offer any highlights from those.
Well, I think I would just direct people to go there and check out the updates, since that was back in the primary, that was in March, that we had lengthy elections about all sorts of policy stances on housing, on inequality, on the environment, on criminal justice reform. We covered a lot of ground there, and I think some of those the statements really reflect where the candidates have moved to, or what they've shifted their focus to since then, since we have had a global pandemic since then for them to worry about.
Right.
And it's not just the state Senate candidates that we spoke to. We also spoke with candidates and the incumbents for the state assembly as well.
Right. And then we are, both of our organizations have done some reporting on the state propositions. Again, if you go to our voter guide, you can find that. We have also linked to extensive analysis from Cal Matters, which is a nonprofit news organization that does coverage of state issues. We have another question from Janet. Why does the teachers union oppose Tom Temprano and Chanel Williams for College Board? Do we have any insight on this?
I can't personally speak to that. I have not talked with them.
Don't.
But Joe might.
I can only imagine it's because of what would be perceived by the teachers as parsimonious budget practices and willingness to cut classes, which they did as incumbents. They cut many classes because of the budgetary crisis at the college. And when you cut classes, you cut teachers. And many venerable city college teachers were cut down to very little or nothing. And I can understand why a teachers union again would object to this. So, these are positions that aren't out of the blue. There are certainly explanations for either way, and which one resonates with you more will probably color how you vote. That would be my best educated guess on this matter.
Okay, so I'm going to do last call for questions from our audience members. If you have any questions, please direct them to Daphne Magnawa. In the meantime, Laura, Joe, I'd love to give you a chance to say, is there anything that you wanted to clarify from what you said earlier, or any final words or resources that you would like to direct people to as they try to figure out what they're going to do about their voting on the local ballot issues and candidates?
Well, I guess I'll just give a quick mention to an interview that's airing on Civic, or that actually just finished airing in the last hour. But we did take a sort of equity lens look at the various tax measures on the ballot with a tax expert. His name is Donnie Charleston. And so he talked with us about that and sort of took a closer look at, what tools do local governments have in their toolbox to address inequality and racial equity in particular. And so that will be on our podcast feed shortly later this evening.
Okay. Daphne, any final words, or should I go ahead and wrap things up? Or Joe, forgive me, Joe, final words from you.
I would urge everybody to measure twice and cut once. I would urge everybody in this era of disinformation to be very careful and not believe everything they read. And to check the bylines. If you trust me, that's great, but you should still question what I write. Not, you should in a spirited way, what the Chronicle writes, what I write, what Laura writes, etc. But you should really question something you read that somebody sent you on a website that you've never heard of, or that somebody mails to your house. There are no requirements for honesty in political ads. Specifically, no requirements for honesty. You can make things up. There's no rules against that. And I would urge everybody to do their homework. I would urge everybody to really research the candidates and research the propositions. While I ostensibly am against looking at endorsements to decide things, I think it's a great way to decide what you're against. I think that if you have very distinctive feelings about the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, what they want and what they don't want might be of great import to you. And I think more important than what people support, which is often just political back scratching, I think everybody should look and see who's paying whom. I think that is the more important measure. And that can be done at sfethics.org. And you can go through and see who's paying whom. And it is relatively straightforward. And if you can't decipher the Excel spreadsheets, as I often can't, find yourself a 25-year-old who can do it for you. The young people of today are very resourceful. And I would urge that level of approach to voting. I think it's kind of like doing your taxes. In San Francisco, we can't really believe all of the talkings about, vote by mail, because in San Francisco, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of us already voted by mail. And you should, because these ballots are huge. You can't stand there and just make up your mind. That would be the acme of foolishness. You will not make educated decisions. You do need to do your work ahead of time. And it's a pain in the ass, but this is the city we live in.
I'll add to that, actually. I mean, one of the reasons why, I'll plug our voter guide is because we specifically don't make endorsements. So if endorsements are not your cup of tea, you won't find them on our voter guide. So go check that out.
I think Public Press does a great job. I think KQED does a great job, and I think there are a few other organizations that do a great job. And there are some that don't do a great job. If I'm going to name a name,
we're not going to diss anybody, Joe.
Well, then I'll be opaque and say, if you're going to make endorsements, you should write out a full explanation, and you should make the arguments instead of writing postage stamp sized explanations about the many endorsements that affect people's lives in San Francisco.
On that note, thank you all. I'm just going to do a quick wrap up. If I miss anything, jump in. For those of you who joined us late, we've been talking with Laura Wenus, who is the host of Civic, which is the daily news and public affairs show from the San Francisco Public Press. It airs on KSFP 102.5 FM in San Francisco, also streaming online, and you can download the podcast from your favorite platform. You can find out more at sfpublicpress.org/civic. You can find our voter guide linked at the top of our homepage in an enormous banner at sfpublicpress.org. You can find all kinds of great reporting from Joe Eskenazi, the managing editor of Mission Local at missionlocal.org, and some great reporting from his colleagues who have also covered some of these important issues and races. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will post, this will be available on YouTube. And one last thing, in our voter guide, there are text summaries, there are short audio summaries. If you, for no other people who would like listening to audio summaries, there are links out to more extended analysis and in some cases to Civic shows that go in depth, that Laura had conversations with some of the people we talked about who support or oppose these various measures. Thank you all for joining us today. And Daphne, thank you. Daphne McNauer, our Director of Membership and Community, thank you for keeping us on track and on schedule. I think we're ready to call